No goofy intro today. This topic is simply too important. Too vital to our understanding of Canada and the Canadian wilds. No, I could regale you with ancient tales of the Kanakanomicon, but today, we return to our roots. We return to the sorts of tales that make the Kanakanomicon so great. Today, we are talking about Bigfoots.
Big feet.
Okay, or maybe it's one of those plural nouns where they don't add an S, like elk.
Elks.
Yeah, you don't say elks, you just say elk. It's just like a herd of elk, not a herd of elks.
Okay, if you want to believe that, you go right ahead.
It's true. It's the plural of elks. The plural of elk is not elks.
Oh.
You don't go out hunting elks. You go out hunting elks.
You probably should, though. You probably should.
Sorry.
Hunt elks. We're going elks hunting.
Elks hunting. So, yeah, today we're talking about Bigfoot. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm very happy about Bigfoot.
Yeah, well, you are one, right? I mean, I am. I got a huge feet.
I'm not. I'm a tiny foot.
You're a mini foot.
Oh, it gets wider as I get older, not longer.
Introduce ourselves. I forgot to do that. I'm Benjamin Wandio. I'm here with my dad, Todd, Dirty Clyde Wandio. And you are, of course, listening to the Kanakanomicon, though I'm assuming you know that if you're tuning in. So thank you for joining us. You can listen to our back catalog if you want at any podcatcher and all that stuff, but we'll get to that at the end of the episode. So today we're going to be talking about what I think is probably the big daddy of cryptozoology in North America, which is Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the abominable snowman, the jacko, old yellow top, skunk ape, the woolly booger.
The woolly booger. I have never heard that one.
It's apparently one of the names for Bigfoots.
He's the woolly booger.
The woolly booger.
Awesome.
So, yeah, this is, I think, kind of one of the big daddies of cryptozoology, and we have these kind of wild man or ape man legends all over the world. They're as ubiquitous as stories about like giant monsters of any sort is the ape man or wild man. The North America has, I would say, a long history with the North American wood ape. Or at least it does if you're willing to equate a lot of First Nations legends with tales of Bigfoot, which some are and some aren't. The name Sasquatch itself is actually an anglicization of the Salish word Seskuuts, which means wild man or hairy man.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these stories are definitely hoaxes, like Jacko, which is also known as the British Columbia gorilla. It was a hoax that was pulled by some newspaper authors about a supposed primate that had been caught in British Columbia, but turned out to be fake. Others are less so, like many of the eyewitness accounts that were recorded in John Zeta's book, In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of Sasquatch. But there's no doubt that at the very least, a lot of these stories are really fascinating and capture the imagination in some way.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the basis of Sasquatch is that that people have always wanted to believe that we're not alone. That's the whole UFO thing. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't want to be alone in the universe. And I think as we started to populate the wild parts of our planet, so the mountainous regions, for instance,
Yeah.
we wanted to believe that because they were largely devoid of humanity when we got there.
Totally empty.
Right? And so we wanted there to be something out there.
Well, and I think there's something interesting. Stories like Sasquatch is kind of this mythologizing of the wilderness. So it's comparing the human person to the human animal. So a lot of wild man stories, which is where kind of Bigfoot and Sasquatch and ape men kind of originate, are these wild man stories. Focus on the savageness of these others that live out in the wilderness, these hairy, naked ape men. You know, we have wild man stories from like the Orkney Islands as well, all sorts. You have the legends of the Fomor and the Furbolgs in old Celtic mythology. All sorts. The abominable snowman, the Yeti, is another example of a great wild man story. But we have them all over the world. Like almost every country has some sort of wild man or yowie or yahoo or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And they go back like literally thousands of years of these sorts of stories being out there. In particular, the Sasquatch is this kind of mythologizing of the Canadian wilderness. It's this large, wild, elusive, untamable being that lives in the woods. It's kind of taken on this folkloric nature in our modern times as this kind of semi-invisible, in some cases, universe-hopping, like, creature that just lives out in the wilderness. And I mean, scientists are pretty certain at this point that no such creature exists, but this has done little to dissuade the many erstwhile cryptozoologists eager to find hard evidence of the North American ape man. There are so many different organizations that sole purpose is to try and find physical evidence of a Sasquatch.
I think more than any cryptid, the Sasquatch,
Definitely.
the Bigfoot,
Yeah.
is the number one.
Yeah, it's the big daddy. I would say when we think of cryptids and cryptozoology, at least in North America,
Yeah.
we think of Sasquatch.
Yeah.
He's like the quintessential crypto.
Agreed.
It was actually found in 2012 that 21% of Canadians believe Bigfoot is probably or definitely real, with Albertans actually being the most likely to believe in Bigfoot.
Is that right?
Yeah. And Canada was 8% behind Americans. In the United States, it was 29% of Americans believe that Bigfoot probably or definitely is real.
Oh.
So that's about 1 in 5 people, and I'll tell you where I stand towards the end of the episode, but we'll get there. I'll build up an argument to get there.
Okay.
So Bigfoot has been theorized to exist since the late 50s. No body or physical evidence beyond footprints has ever been found of a Bigfoot, and confirmed at any rate. It seems pretty self-explanatory that we can't find this creature. North America is a huge continent, and there's lots of places where a Bigfoot could hide. But most of the sightings are actually made in the Pacific Northwest and California. So we're talking kind of the Washington region, southeastern British Columbia in Canada is where a lot of the sightings take place, or southwestern rather. That's where Vancouver is. Mm-hmm. Chilliwack, Vancouver, that whole metropolitan area, Surrey.
All along
down there.
the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What they call the Pacific Northwest. It's not really that northwest.
Well, in the States, it's northwest.
Yeah, in Canada it's not at all.
In Canada, it's southwest.
Yeah, it's the Pacific Southwest. The Pacific Northwest is like south of Alaska.
Yes.
But stories of creatures similar to Sasquatch actually go back long before Europeans ever showed up here. In fact, let's talk about the origins of Sasquatch, which actually predates Bigfoot.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the term Sasquatch is actually quite a bit older than the term Bigfoot. There are many First Nation stories of creatures similar to the Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and perhaps the most well-known of these is from the Sta'alis peoples in southwest British Columbia. J.W. Burns was an Indian agent, so that was a white man who worked for the
Fur companies.
Office of Indian Affairs.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right, because this is 1929, so we're
Right.
past Northwest Trading Company days.
Yeah.
This is 1929. This is a guy working for the Indian office. He was working on the reserve that at the time was called the Chehalis Reserve. Now we call it the Sta'alis, because that's closer. I can't do Salish words. I'd really try. So forgive me if I'm butchering this. I did look up the pronunciation. I don't have enough experience with Salish to actually pronounce it very well.
Right.
He actually coined the term in Maclean's magazine. So Maclean's magazine, for our American listeners who may not know, is kind of like Time magazine for Canada. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. It's Canada's Time.
Yeah. It's our big kind of cultural, political,
Weekly.
weekly magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weekly news mag, as opposed to a weekly sort of entertainment magazine like Saturday Evening Post would be more.
Yeah.
Your weekly entertainment magazine, but
Yeah.
Maclean's
Yeah.
is your weekly news mag like Time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so his article came out on April 1st of 1929 alongside a Clark's Pork and Beans ad, which declares that the canned products to be Canada's national dish, be it Mountie or city man, field worker or mechanic, young or old. Clark's Pork and Beans affords a splendid, nourishing dish.
Oh, that it does. Yummy,
So
yummy.
in the article, yeah, that's right. Clark's Pork and Beans.
You get me some beans with pork in them.
In the article, Burns details the eyewitness account of a Sta'alis man, Peter Williams, who claims to have seen a so-called Sasquatch. He also details the story of Charlie Victor, another First Nations gentleman from Chilliwack, not far from Vancouver, where Charlie had actually had a conversation with a Sasquatch woman and shot a child. Not a Sasquatch child, but a child by mistake.
Ouch.
So Peter Williams' story is your pretty typical Sasquatch sighting. He's walking through the bush. I can't remember what he was doing. I think he was out hunting or fishing. He's walking out in the bush, and he looks up from the creek, and there's a Sasquatch standing there, and it, kind of looks at him, then looks away and lopes off into the woods. That's pretty much how every Bigfoot sighting goes.
And so he took a pot shot at him?
No, this is Peter Williams. This isn't Charlie Victor.
Okay.
We'll get to Charlie Victor in a second. So Sasquatch shows up.
Yeah.
In I think the most exciting Sasquatch stories, sometimes Sasquatch will throw rocks at you.
Yeah.
That's pretty common. But in this one, in Peter Williams' story, Sasquatch just looks at him, has a kind of a kind face, and then lopes off into the wilderness. Charlie Victor's story is a little different. So he allegedly actually spoke to a wild woman in his story. So basically how that story went is he was out bear hunting. Charlie Victor was a bear hunter. And his dog had run off into a cave and was wrestling something. And he thought it was a bear. So he gets ready to take a shot. His dog comes out, wrestling something. He shoots at it, and then sees a white boy laying there. He said the boy was naked. He had no clothes on. He had kind of a curly brown hair. And then, just as he's investigating the child, a big Sasquatch woman comes out of the bush and says to him in what's called the Douglas language, or the Douglas tongue, which is a Lillooet dialect from the Port Douglas area. So it speaks to him in Salish language and says, "You shot my friend." And goes over and is waving something around that at first he thought was a snake, but then realized it was some kind of animal entrail and was smacking it on the ground and cursed Charlie to never kill another bear. And Charlie started getting dizzy. He watched as the wild woman picked the child up and ran off into the bush, and is now apparently paralyzed at the time that he's talking to Burns. Mm-hmm. The extent of his paralysis is not specified, but Charlie blames his encounter with the wild woman for his paralysis.
Of course he does. He didn't just have a stroke, eh?
Well, but that's the thing. We don't know. I don't know how paralyzed he is, but he says, I used to strangle bears with my bare hands.
Sure, yeah. What you remember on our episode about the
of the Nahanni Valley?
Yes, the Nahanni Valley.
Yeah.
And those sort of strange mountain people, those isolated tribes.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk a little bit about them, but the Nakanni, is that the one you were thinking of?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the Nakanni peoples who supposedly lived up in the Nahanni Valley there. And it was essentially a name that was synonymous with enemy tribe or enemies.
Right.
Or others, something like that. Yeah,
I'm reminiscent. It reminds me of that.
Yeah,
kind of idea. Hairy woman.
Yeah, well, he's like his story paints her in I would not call a positive light. He definitely describes her as being savage and. Like, he's like, I used to strangle bears with my hands, but I'm telling you, I wouldn't have been able to take that woman down. She was so big and scary. He supposes that her tribe had kidnapped a white boy and was raising him as one of their own.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, so that's our story from Charlie Victor here. He gets cursed by a Sasquatch, which I should point out nowadays, Sasquatch is often given kind of superpowers of some sort. The ability to talk telepathically is one that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of Bigfoot sightings have people communicating telepathically with Bigfoot, or with Bigfoot being associated with like interdimensional travel or invisibility. And that's why you can never see Bigfoot or find a Bigfoot, is because they're invisible and they live in another dimension and they're only pseudo-real, or all sorts of crazy
That
ideas.
seems to be one of the more recent sort of shifts in cryptozoology, is that these are extra-dimensional creatures that pop in and out of our reality.
The other one that's really coming really popular nowadays is... the idea that they're essentially tulpas, or just beings that came into existence because we believe they exist.
Yeah. Well,
They're psychic manifestations of something.
Yeah.
And I kind of blame podcasts for that a bit, because there's a certain really big podcast where that's their go-to line with a lot of weird stuff is that, well, it's real, but it's kind of only sort of real because we believe it's real and magic.
Yeah. And we all know magic is real.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way to have these things still exist while there is no physical hard evidence that they exist.
Yeah, because nobody can disprove my theory.
Yeah, nobody can disprove that invisible monsters are real.
Yeah.
So, here's a question. How seriously do you think J.W. Burns was taking these stories?
I don't think very. I think he was thinking of them more like folk tales. Tall tales.
I think McLean's wasn't taking them very seriously at all.
Right.
Just taking a look at the publication date, April 1st.
Yeah.
It's April Fool's, right?
Yeah, yeah.
As far as whether or not Burns was taking the story seriously, possibly he might have been. His main argument was that maybe there's something living out in the BC woods, which maybe there was. It was 1929. British Columbia was not the heavily developed region that it is now, and even now it's not that heavily developed.
Right.
Like, we only get to see the developed parts of the mountain regions, but there's tons of it that's totally undeveloped.
Right, and
it's all just...
It was all on
woodlands.
fire last year.
Yeah. And Canada, just in 1929 in general, was a far wilder place.
Oh, yeah.
And Bigfoot mania hadn't really caught on yet. So I don't know that Burns ever thought his Sasquatch idea would really catch on or become all that popular. As far as he was concerned, these were just some funny tales that, First Nations people shared with him. Although, I will say in his article, he said he had a hard time getting them to talk about it because a lot of them told him, white man doesn't believe, he just wants to make a joke out of the Indian.
Oh.
That was a line that he heard a lot of the time. So, to be fair, I think these Salish people who had these experiences did take them very seriously.
Right.
And it's interesting because Peter Williams really tried hard to say that, just so you know, these wild men, these big feet, or these Sasquatches is the word they use, they're not related to us Indians. That was a big part of Peter Williams, and I'm saying Indian because that's the term Peter Williams used.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Charlie Victor, on the other hand, said that because this woman spoke the Douglas language, that she was, an Indian.
Right.
We must be related to them because they speak our language.
Yeah.
So there was two very contradictory ideas behind Sasquatch being presented by these two, and I think it kind of reflects how the two individuals felt about white people. More than I think it reflected anything about the Sasquatch legends themselves.
Right.
It was reflecting how they wanted to be perceived by the white man. Are we these savage, do we care that they think we're savages? Or do we want to try and present an air of civility, like, of being, not an air, but a feeling of being more civilized like they are.
Right. So they drew a line in the sand between the wild people of the woods and the civilized.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is an interesting kind of dichotomy that we see in how these stories are being perceived by these two individuals. If nothing else, Burns definitely kind of set the framework around which Canadians would come to understand the coming Bigfoot upsurge in the late 50s and early 60s. I should state that the stories of wild men in the region predate these accounts as well.
Right.
There are much earlier accounts. These are just based on a series of Salish legends describing these creatures. And I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the early sightings of Bigfoot take place in British Columbia and the American Pacific Northwest, where these sorts of legends would have been a lot more commonly heard.
Right.
Although, that's not where the first sighting of Bigfoot would come up. But since you brought them up, let's talk a little bit about the Nakanee. So we talked about them last time in our episode on the Nahanni Valley. If you don't want to go back, if you're a new listener and you don't want to go back and listen to that because it is a two-parter.
Well, then shame on you.
Well, yes, shame on you. You should. But also, two of my podcast colleagues, Nothing Ever Happens in Canada and Norwestern Whispers, also cover it. Nothing Ever Happens in Canada. I think they cover more of the prospector stories. But Norwestern Whispers did like the ghosts and curses and cryptozoology of the region, so you might want to check them out too. They're also one of our only patrons. So
Yeah.
So this is a really good one to bring up. Father Emile Petitot was the Petito. I don't know, how do you pronounce that name? It's French. My wife always gives me a hard time about how I pronounce French.
How you mispronounce French. You did pretty good.
Yeah, Petito, Petitot, I don't know.
Petito would probably be, yeah, like potato.
He was one of the first white men to write about the Nakanee wildmen. He was a 19th century oblate missionary who lived among the Slavey and Satu Dene. According to him, the Dene lived in a kind of existential fear of this creature throughout the summer months. Basically, this constant fear that this invisible creature was going to get them. Ethnographer Cornelius B. Osgood also mentioned this creature briefly, saying that the Dene tribes would often uproot camp if they believed a Nakanee was lurking nearby. So they would see things like, oh, there's a weird footprint, or if they were hearing calls in the night that were unusual, they might just move, believing that a Nakanee was nearby.
Wow.
I can't say for sure how true this kind of portrayal is of the Satu and the Slavey Dene, but this is certainly what Cornelius Osgood felt about him. Though the Nakanee, as it's described, matches a lot of Bigfoot lore. Kind of the modern Bigfoot lore of what a Bigfoot looks like. It's tall, it's covered in curly dark hair, and it has red eyes. Mm-hmm. Those red eyes is always a big thing in almost every Bigfoot story that you hear.
Well, in fact, red eyes are the sort of the I don't know, the general eye color of cryptids.
Not just cryptids, but
which, it's true.
It's evil. It's the color of evil.
Well, and when if someone wants you to believe that this is not a creature of this earth or not a sort of a natural thing, they give it red eyes.
Always.
But if you're seeing something in firelight, which a lot of these, or it's gonna all I saw was red eyes. Well, that's what you'd see if you saw yourself in firelight.
Maybe not yourself, because we don't have night vision.
Right.
But a lot of wild animals, their eye light will reflect red. Because those are the kind of easier to perceive wavelengths of light in darker light.
Right.
If you don't want to burn out your night vision, you don't use blue light.
Right.
Because you're usually trying to receive. That's what it is. You're usually receiving blue light when you're using night vision, and reflecting red light. You're getting the red light out of your eyes.
Right.
Which is why if you're walking around late at night and you need to see, it's actually better to use a red tinted light than a blue tinted light. Which is part of why when you're driving down the highway and somebody has those new LED headlamps that are like that blue-white light, it always burns your eyes right out. Even though they're technically no brighter than the yellow headlights don't burn as much because your eyes, like your sensitive cones, aren't the yellow ones, it's the blue ones.
Right. Makes sense.
So, yeah. But that's the same thing. So when you're reflecting for eye light, when you're looking for nocturnal animals, often what you'll see reflected back is red light.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with like predatory animals.
Mm-hmm. And cryptids, apparently.
And cryptids.
And especially
and
the Nakani.
Yeah, the Nakani or any Bigfoot.
Yeah.
Almost every Bigfoot is described as having red eyes.
Yes.
So, last time we talked about them, they were wrapped up in a lot of the stories of the Nahanni Valley, which, if you don't know, is sometimes called the Headless Valley because a couple of prospectors got their heads chopped off. We don't know why or by whom, but people have blamed all sorts of things for it, including the Nakani, who some have said have a penchant for decapitation as a result of this. Fact is, the valley wasn't called Headless Valley before the McLeod brothers disappeared. A lot of dubious websites will tell you that it was called the Headless Valley before the McLeod brothers, and that's the ancient meaning of Nahanni. It's not. Nahanni was the name of a tribe that lived there.
Right.
It did not mean Headless Valley.
Yeah.
It's just, it was called that because some prospectors disappeared and had bodies were found with their heads missing, and then a bunch of other people disappeared and went missing in this dangerous whitewater rafting valley. So is it really a big surprise that people were disappearing out in this mountainous subarctic region?
Probably the number of people disappearing there are no different from people disappearing in any wilderness area.
No, and I genuinely think it was just because white people had started disappearing there due to the gold rush.
Right.
So, but the Nakani seems to, it's funny because it's later accounts that make them these big hairy ape men, but a lot of ethnographers who went in and interviewed them found that the Nakani were typically just kind of thought of as another tribe, one that was less advanced and more warlike than the other Dene tribes in the region.
So probably more isolated.
Yeah, and it's quite possible that this is some sort of oral history or ancestral memory of another tribe that lived in the region. But it's not the only one that's even reported from that region. Canadian folk historian Pierre Burton also talks about the Mahoney, which he describes as an enormous hairy giant with red eyes who eats human flesh and swallows entire birch trees with a single gulp. And there are many, many similar legends. And so it's easy to see where Whitey might pick up some of the less mystical portions of some of these stories. And that's not entirely true. Like I said, a lot of people have now, especially in more recent years, started kind of ascribing pseudo-natural powers to Bigfoot.
Right.
To create a legend of a large, hairy ape man who wanders the unspoilt wildernesses of North America. So, what about those legends, and where did the modern Bigfoot as he exists today come to be? What are your thoughts?
I'm going to bet that 8mm camera footage of the Bigfoot down in, I think it was in California, in the mountains.
California is where
Yeah.
the original Bigfoot stories come from. I will agree with you there. But I'm gonna paint a word picture for you. Okay? It's 1958 and it's September. A California loggerman named Jerry Crew is getting ready for work. Puts on his hard hat and climbs up into his bulldozer. Then he sees them, Large humanoid footprints press deep into the earth. He tells his job boss Shorty about the footprints, and he and the other workers talk for a while about what could have possibly made them. Then Shorty offhandedly tells the men to let him know if they see any apes running about, but for now it's time to get back to work. Before long, the men had come up with a story about a figure they called Bigfoot, on account of his large feet, and they had no doubt that it was a he given the size of those feet. And he was responsible for everything from vandalism to stealing a 450-pound drum of diesel fuel a year before. They wrote a letter and sent it to a local journalist, Andrew Genzoli, who wrote for the Humboldt Times, who joked in his article about the letter that maybe California has a relative of the abominable snowman of the Himalayas. This is the first legend of Bigfoot, a name kind of now synonymous with the great northwestern rainforest, the pine barrens of West Virginia, the swamps of Florida, though there he is more commonly called the skunk ape, and even the Canadian Shield wildernesses of Ontario, where he's sometimes known as Old Yellowtop, on account of a picture taken of an ape man with a yellow head. It just kind of looks like a blonde ape man.
Yeah.
Some others have apparently called it Donald Trump, but I think that may have been just some wiki editing gone totally awry.
But accurately.
Very accurately.
Yes.
So, the word Sasquatch was coined in 1929, but Bigfoot doesn't come around until 1958 in Genzoli's article in the Humboldt Times. So this is around the 50s when we first see these disparate tales of wild men, many of which originate with First Nations stories, being conglomerated into kind of a single canon of wild man stories for North America surrounding the idea of Bigfoot. Betty Allen, who was another writer with the Humboldt Times, who was one of the people who wrote follow-up articles to Genzoli's initial article, felt that in her interviews, the loggers didn't actually believe in a Bigfoot. They just kind of thought these are some joke somebody was playing, some little hoax, and, you know, it's fun to make jokes about the gremlins at your logging camp, right? You know, you got to have something to talk about on your breaks while you're, you know, smoking and drinking whiskey or whatever they did in 1958. I just assumed that's what everybody did. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I agree. I think it sounds to me like they were just blaming any misfortune in the camp or any misdeeds in the camp on this Bigfoot.
Bigfoot. Yeah, that was exactly it, right? They're just old workers' tales.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. They chalked it up to being a hoax, and that's exactly what they were. Let me paint you another word picture. It's 1958. A 37-year-old man by the name of Ray L. Wallace wipes his brow, beholding his masterpiece. A pair of hand-carved wooden footprint stamps rests on his workbench. It's a lot of work for what's sure to be a dumb joke to play on some old California loggers, but it'll be worth a few chuckles at least. So he hops in his car and sets out to the bush. He creeps around the logging camp at night, using his big footprints like stamps, leaving tracks around the logging camp and around the bulldozer. So, you can imagine Ray's surprise when he reads the newspaper on September 21st and sees Andrew Genzoli's article. This was indeed his masterpiece, a true prank for the ages, a story that had completely taken on a life of its own. Prior to Ray's prank, Wildmen had kind of been a series of disparate myths, local legends here and there, most of which were likely constrained to certain First Nations groups or small towns. But for whatever reason, Ray's little joke galvanized something. Might have been all the fumes and the leaded fuel that people were using back then. It might have been the emergence of science fiction and horror films and novels. Maybe it was just a way to relieve the tension of the fear of a communist uprising. Or it might have just been pure coincidence, but Ray L. Wallace had turned a couple of carved feet into a legend that would last for decades to come. And you've probably seen Ray on documentaries, and if not Ray himself, definitely his kids. Because they have come out time and again to try and tell people they were the ones who actually made the footprints. Bigfoot isn't real. We did this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the time, though, all they accomplish in doing is letting another cryptozoological documentarian film crew be able to say, maybe, but what about?
Yeah.
As they cut to another conspiracy theory about the government hiding a Bigfoot in a basement somewhere, or genetically testing Bigfoot hair and hiding the results. I should point out, that last one actually did happen. Peter Byrne sent in to the FBI what he believed to be Bigfoot fur, and the FBI records on those tests were released, though the tests were initially run in the 1970s. They weren't released until the whole disclosure thing happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it concluded that the fur came from a member of the deer family.
Mm-hmm. Other since DNA, other samples have come back as brown bear.
Yep. That's a very common one, brown bear. Even that supposed Himalayan Sasquatch skin got tested, and it was a bear. They weren't able to tell what kind, but it was some species of bear.
Yeah, but that sample that they were using was old.
Ancient.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I mean, made a lot of sense because it's really rare to see brown bear up in the Himalayas anyway.
Well, and the fur wasn't even brown; it was white. So this was some sort of albino specimen or undiscovered species of bear that was living in the Himalayas.
Right.
And we don't know how far back it was because we don't really know how old the skin is. Because it's been kept in a isolated temple, which incidentally Peter Byrne had actually visited, the guy who sent in the supposed Bigfoot fur to the FBI.
Oh, okay.
He was an American Yeti hunter before the Bigfoot thing took off.
Mm-hmm.
And he had actually first got interested in it when he was on an expedition with the British Royal Air Force in Bombay, India, where he went on a search for Yeti. Also, he visited that Himalayan temple in Nepal in 1958, where he had his picture taken with a supposed Yeti scalp.
Oh.
So that's a lot of talk of American Bigfoot. But what about Bigfoot in Canada? Well, we do have stories of Bigfoot in Canada. Like I said, most Canadian stories center around the idea of Sasquatch and actually predate Bigfoot. Sasquatch, the legendary critter from British Columbia, was famously the subject of a legal case. In 2018, a group of Bigfoot believers actually tried to take the BC government to court to get them to say Bigfoot is real. Todd Standing, creator of the Netflix documentary Discovering Bigfoot, attempted to take BC to court for failing to protect Bigfoot's environment.
No.
He might have had standing if he had been fighting to protect the environment of, say, the endangered Vancouver Island wolf, which is a distinct subspecies of gray wolf of whom only 150 are believed to be left. The lawsuit was, needless to say, thrown out as frivolous, and Todd Standing, having been involved in a similar case in California, was marked as a vexatious litigant, meaning that future lawsuits on this topic that he brings forward are not going to be looked at.
Yeah.
There have been tons of sightings of Bigfoot. I already mentioned Old Yellow Top, but we have a ton up here. But I will say that most of the sightings that we have nowadays are not really exciting stories to talk about. And mostly they're kind of grainy, shaky cam footage or pictures of shadows hiding amidst trees that look like they could maybe be a hairy man if you squint your eyes and tilt your head just so.
Yeah.
I really think the graininess and the poor quality of these pictures is unforgivable in this day and age. My phone can take high definition documentary quality footage without even trying.
Yeah.
Which means that anytime I see a shaky shot of some dark shape, I'm almost certainly going to call shenanigans. I can understand not wanting to take your best phone with you camping, but even the crappiest phone camera is absolute gold compared to the digital cameras from the days of yore. Heck, if you go through a list of the worst phones in the last decade, not a single member of that list is ridiculed for having a low-resolution camera.
Yeah.
The worst one I saw was a slow camera, meaning it takes a long time to take a picture.
Yeah.
Even Garmin, the sat-nav company, made a phone with a good camera on it, even though everything else about this phone was terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't know who Garmin is, and that's probably because you don't spend a lot of time out in the wilderness, they make
GPS.
GPS navigation devices.
Yeah.
That's like all they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, even the cheapest box camera that you could have bought when in the 60s would have taken, took better pictures than some of the garbage that you see people trying to pass off as actual footage of Bigfoot.
Yeah. I mean, we have, like, I can understand not having a lot of good pictures from, like, the 60s or the 70s or even the 90s, because just things could happen in developing. Photosensitive paper is not as reliable as a solid digital camera now.
Mm-hmm.
But considering that I can go out and buy a digital SLR for like $200, but even without that, my phone camera can take like 4K level pictures. Like, there's no excuse for not being able to recognize something in a photograph nowadays.
No.
Unless you're trying to obscure it. I
agree. And I think a lot of the footage that we see, there's I think one of the more recent photos I saw of a quote-unquote Bigfoot was the face, the intelligent eyes.
Yeah.
But the more I looked at the picture, the more I was convinced I was looking at a brown bear.
Yeah.
Kind of just through, the branches are turned this way and that way, obscuring the snout. And all you see was the intelligent brown eyes.
Which bears have.
Yes.
Like, people kind of expect all animals to look as dumb as deer.
Yeah.
But the fact is, that's mostly herbivores that look like that.
Yeah.
And it's not because they're dumb, it's because their eyes are on the side of their head to give them a broader field of view so they can see predators coming.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no,
Yeah. So, I'm saying this as a person who sincerely wants to believe in the fantastical world of Bigfoots, but I regret to inform you, I'm a skeptic. I don't say this out of derisiveness for those who do believe in Bigfoots and go hard. Like, I was once one of you. But there comes a time when we must put aside childish things, as the good book says. Unfortunately, the evidence of a Bigfoot just isn't there. Yes, Canada's wilderness is big and wild and spread out, but then why are all these sightings coming out of places like California or southeastern British Columbia or southwestern British Columbia or other places that are actually quite heavily developed? Well, because that's where all the people are.
Yeah.
Right? You're not getting these sightings from hunters who went on a fly-in expedition to an isolated valley in, one of the parts of British Columbia that isn't a national park or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean...
Which is almost none of it.
To me, the most likely residence for Bigfoot would be Yukon.
Yeah. Because...
The moose there, grow the size of like small elephants, pretty much.
Yeah,
They're huge.
They're enormous.
Right?
Yeah.
Enormous. And no matter how many trophy hunters go up there, they don't even touch the population of moose. And
No.
so the most likely, food source for something that large, if there's a cryptid ape-like creature, it would not be a herbivore.
No, it would have to be at least omnivorous, like a brown bear.
Yes.
It would have to be. It would just have to be.
Yeah.
And further, like I would expect to see more sightings coming from hunters and such in areas like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? The fact is, we have so much footage of kind of elusive and rare animals coming out of those regions.
Yes.
People taking footage of brown bears or black bears or
Or even the odd polar bear that makes its way south.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have footage of that, but we don't have footage of a Bigfoot.
No.
We don't have hard evidence of a Bigfoot.
And you know why? Outdoorsmen know what they're looking at.
Yeah.
That's, city folk or the untrained eye doesn't know what it's looking at. And
and they're not going to get a shitty photo of a Bigfoot because they're stalkers, right? They know how to track an animal.
Yeah.
If they saw a Bigfoot, they're not going to just take the first shot they can get. They're going to wait until they can get a clear shot, just like if they were going to shoot it with their gun, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would expect to have some sort of better evidence of a Bigfoot. Unless, of course, you subscribe to the idea that Bigfoot is aware of cameras and purposely avoids them. Which you might. I don't know.
Well, I think at one time the stories of Bigfoot, of this creature that lives in the forest, is kind of insular and elusive. Probably
made a lot more sense.
Well, it made sense, and it made sense in the context of the First Nations people, who there's lots of tribes that may have lost contact. We still are encountering, even in the Amazon, tribes that have no contact with humans, right?
Yeah.
What humans? I shouldn't say that. I mean, with civilization,
with other people,
right?
Yeah.
So. Those stories I can see having validity. And then, of course, those stories grow.
Yeah. And I would say even the idea of an ape, of a great ape living in North America, I could have bought up until the late 90s.
Yeah.
Like, genuinely. Because up until the late 90s, technology was not as ubiquitous, especially film and recording technology. So there was always a possibility that maybe there is some undiscovered animal living in the wilderness of Canada, because Canada's a huge, huge country. North America is a massive continent, and not everybody's touting around a camera.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And those who are probably aren't touting around their high quality, $300 SLR out into the bush unless they're a wilderness photographer.
Right. But if you're a wilderness photographer, you're going to find it.
Yeah. Well, and that's true. That's possible.
I mean, they find everything else.
Yeah. Well, I will say, like, we were still discovering mammals, like relatively large mammals in the Amazon rainforest up until the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Although I will say that I think the Amazon is a lot more impassable than North America is. Because we have a much more temperate climate. We are not having to worry as much about getting disease from bug bites as you're going through the bush up here.
Right.
Especially if you're going through in the summer, not in the winter.
Also, I mean, the Amazon and other rainforests are very special ecosystems. And so the variety of life that exists there is so much more diverse than the northern areas. Northern areas tend to be more an evenly distributed population of creatures that are known to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't
Yeah,
have, oh, there's only one of these on, or the range of
well,
the
we have.
Sasquatch must be so massive.
It would have to. It would have to be. Yeah, like unless it's like really isolated to some very narrow valley in the Pacific Northwest, but I have no idea where that would even be. Because most of the Pacific Northwest, like, it's mountainous, but it's not like Rocky Mountains mountainous. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that with the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Northwest. I don't know. Do the Rockies go into like
Yeah.
Washington and those areas?
All the way, well, more into Colorado, but
Right. Yeah.
I just don't see it. I don't buy that there's some creature that, nobody credible has really seen or recorded, that's just sort of wandering up and down the Pacific Northwest.
And if there ever was, we haven't found any remains of it.
No, it makes no sense. We can find dinosaur fossils,
Yeah.
but we can't.
Yeah, and we should note that, like, as far as we can tell, humans are the only hominids to have ever inhabited North and South
There's
America.
no evidence of Neanderthal.
No, those seem to have mostly lived in Asia.
In
and
Europe,
Europe,
mostly in Europe. I
and-
think that was their last stand was
Yeah.
in Europe, in France, I think.
Yeah. And then Homo sapiens and Cro-Magnon kind of came up out of Africa and outcompeted them, but we were just smarter.
Yeah.
Basically. And more adaptable to more varied environments.
Yeah, I think that had more to do with it. Because we were neck and neck, but then competing for the same prime hunting and gathering spots, and we just got out.
And it just seemed that Neanderthal, based on the evidence that we have, was more set, and it had some tool work and some even signs of animal handling, but the indications seem to be that Neanderthal just had a much harder time adapting to different climates than Homo sapiens did. So it's hard to say. But I would genuinely say that I want to believe in Bigfoot, but I don't.
Exactly. I agree.
So I think we'll call the episode there. You guys can find us on wherever good podcasts are found. You can find us at canuckonomicon.libsyn.com. That's canuckonomicon.libsyn.com, which you probably already know because you're listening to this show right now. If not, you're probably listening to us on YouTube. We have 2 subscribers on YouTube.
Woohoo!
And yeah, you can also find us on Twitter at canuckonomicon. You can check up with us on Patreon, patreon.com/canuckonomicon, or buy us a coffee over at ko-fi.com/canuckonomicon. And, send us a couple bucks so that I can fix whatever's wrong with my Wi-Fi. Because my Wi-Fi just likes to drop out for no reason.
Buy a bigger wheel for that hamster that runs your computer.
Yes, that's right.
It's a living.
So thank you very much for listening. Sorry there was no episode last week. I just wanted to take a week off, so
that's
I did.
Good. I had some ideas about an episode or episodes, but I just it never came to fruition for me either.
Yeah, so I did some quick Bigfoot research and got us this little episode together here. But we'll be back next week with probably more serious topic. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'll decide to go read about vampires or something. Find a Canadian connection there. But thank you very much for listening. And if you're out in the bush and you're bringing some peanuts along, maybe leave a few in the trees for Bigfoot to find, and keep your eyes open.
Take care.
Canuckonomicon is a production of Crossing Clay Studios. We can be found on Twitter at Canuckonomicon, and you can contact us through email at canuckonomicon@gmail.com. Please be sure to share us with your friends and family, and keep your eyes open.